how did the communist dictatorships work in practice? Well, there were, I would say, 3 pillars. The first pillar is, of course, that this was a regime that was imposed from the outside. So the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe were guaranteed, so to speak, by the presence of the Red Army and by the presence of Soviet power. And even Czechoslovakia, which was not occupied until 1968, so from 1945 to 1968, was free of Soviet troops. Anyway, the reason why it was free of Soviet troops is because they could be called any moment. And people were very clear about this, that should anything bad happen to the communist regime, of course the Soviets will be there, which is exactly what happened in 1968. So that's a given, in the sense that people knew that nothing is going to happen to this regime. So you, from that moment, have to operate from the assumption that whatever you do, this regime is there to stay and you are there to spend your life in it. And that is, of course, a great factor in explaining how people behaved within the constraints of this dictatorship. The second pillar of the communist regime was, of course, that it was a closed border. So there was no escaping unless the regime gave you permission, or you could escape, but this was rather rare on the grand scale of things. So again, that kind of determines the frame in which people could actually operate in their lives, is because they knew that no matter what, they're there to stay. So it also greatly influences the way you behave, because you know that you are there to be in a dialogue with this power, and you have to determine your behavior accordingly. And the third pillar is, of course, censorship, in the sense that the regime did not allow you to criticize certain aspects. I mean, some criticism was allowed if it were innocuous and not criticizing the system as a whole, and especially if it was not criticizing actual leaders in power. That was strictly impossible. So if you said something about what you actually think about the general secretary of the Communist Party, and usually this was not in positive terms, that was enough to land you in jail. That's the kind of things that was strictly forbidden. So you have to imagine that you live in this regime that is there to stay forever, that is guaranteed by a power that is even far bigger, that you cannot go away, and you cannot speak freely. So that's the constraints of the dictatorship. But this does not mean that people were not social actors in their own way. This does not mean that they lived there in terror just waiting for 70 years until the regime falls. No, that's not like this. It means that people understood what the parameters are, and then they had to define their life accordingly to make the best life possible for themselves within these constraints. Yeah? And what is also important to understand is, contrary to all expectations, the powers, the regimes in place, were actually scared of the population. Precisely because there was no open society, there was no public sphere, so they could not know themselves what the people were actually thinking. And so it was difficult for them to predict if they become extremely unpopular, and if the people are actually ready to wage a revolution. They could not know this because they did not allow the people to speak. So the regimes themselves were in a state of paranoia the entire time that they were in power. And which is something we don't really imagine, because we think they had all powers, so what should they care? Well, they cared very much, in fact. And the one instrument that they used to try and gauge how the people actually felt about it was the secret police and the network of informants. And the role of the informants was to record what the people really thought, and to inform the police, and the police would inform the higher echelon of the party, so that they would know what to expect. So the police would be often there even before all the demonstrators have arrived, because they would know about it in advance. And that was crucial for them. And elements about which often people didn't think is alcohol was the greatest help for the secret police, in the sense that once at the pub you started to have several beers or several shots of vodka, or you name it, and after a while you loosened up, and you, especially if you're in a group of friends, and you started to say what you actually think about this regime, what you think about this president or this general secretary or whoever, And the police always had a lot of informants in pubs, and it was not rare that you would be arrested on the spot just because you dare to say, alcohol loosened your tongue and you actually dare to say what you thought. So that was quite wicked, but unfortunately people needed the alcohol, so that was a great help for the secret police. And then more rarely there were, of course, episodes of armed rebellion or even revolution. There was a great revolution in Hungary in 1956 where people were really wanted to get rid of this regime, wanted to get rid of the Soviet occupation. But the thing is, as I described from the outset, the balance of power was so much in favor of the regimes and so little in favor of the populations that even in the rare cases that they managed to find some weapons, it was really not easy. And there was so many dead, even during the Hungarian Revolution, 3,000 dead, that kind of discouraged any other attempt at open rebellion. And even the Prague Spring, that was actually broken down by the Soviet invasion, caused, so to speak, only about 100 dead, maybe a little more. So the scale already was completely different. And people basically learned the lesson that the only way to oppose the regime was more in terms of words, was more in terms of speaking, and in terms of speaking out in particular. So that's how the dissidents movements were born after 1968, essentially. When dissidents realized that the best way to actually challenge the regime was to take it at its own words. And there was a form of socialist legality. There was a rule of law, a rule of socialist law, but a rule of law nonetheless. And so they realized if you just expose the lies and the propaganda, if it's enough to say it out loud, that what the regime is saying is actually hypocritical, or that it's not even respecting its own sets of laws, then that was enough to expose the regime. That was enough to show that it was based on censorship and on propaganda, on lies. It was enough to speak the truth, and that would be enough of a challenge. And that was especially the case of a dissident movement known as Charter 77, which happened in Czechoslovakia in the year 1977, where the dissidents exactly realized that since Czechoslovakia, as the other communist countries, had signed the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and had engaged themselves into respecting human rights, then they just demanded nothing more that the government should respect what it signed in front of an international audience. So it just said, just respect human rights, let us speak, respect the freedom of word, the freedom of movement, and we can accept the regime. But the regime took this, of course, as a form of treason. Basically, anybody who dared to say that the regime was lying or not telling the truth was considered a traitor. And so many of these Charter 77 signatories ended in jail. Now, apart from the few courageous people who knowingly took the risk of speaking out loud, knowing that this put them in great danger, of course, as I said, the main role for gouging what people really thought was the secret police. The secret police hired a number of informants, and the more unsure of its power it was, the more informants it hired. So the communist country that was for sure the least secure was East Germany, because there was the great example of West Germany. And of course, East Germans had this counter-example of what their country could be if only it was capitalist and democratic instead of being, socialist. So the temptation for the East Germans was even bigger than for any other country. And that's where, by far, they had the biggest number of informants, because that's where they had to map out with the greatest degree of detail, what was going on in this society. And this secret police, by hiring this, by recruiting, often they were not, usually they were not paid, but by recruiting all these informants, basically created a vast amount of archives that is today an invaluable sociological source for knowing what this society was about. for knowing, what people were really saying, what they were really thinking, how they interacted with the regime, what they really thought, and also could be what they really appreciated about the regime. It's not all negative. So that leaves us today, historians, with an enormous amount of data that is actually very interesting to process. But we'll discuss later about how to do that. And then one of the last important elements to know about communism is that this surveillance that was created for the needs of the secret police and of the regime generated not only this feeling of being surrounded by a repressive regime, but it created self-surveillance. For instance, your neighbor sees that you live in the countryside, you own a pig, and sees that you slaughtered the pig illegally without asking for permission. So the neighbor will denounce you, yeah? And so you have something, and maybe you will spend, 3 months in jail for this or something. And next time you see the neighbor doing something that is not completely illegal either, like helping someone doing something, whatever. Of course, the temptation to denounce the neighbor in return as revenge is probably overwhelming, so you're going to do it too. And in fact, you very rapidly get a society in which if you see something that is happening that is not legal, or that you know that the regime would not like, you have the choice to denounce it or not to denounce it. And if you don't denounce it, you can suppose, or you can be almost assured that somebody else will have seen it and denounced it, and also denounced you for not denouncing it. And so that's how you create a society in which, in fact, everybody surveils everybody else. And you have a form of self-policing, in a way, where the people are controlling each other as much as the police controls them. Yeah, this atmosphere that was described as being very unpleasant and very heavy made the people participate themselves to the regime. Yeah, that's what the dissident Václav Havel, who then became president of Czechoslovakia at the fall of communism, he called that auto-totalitarianism. That the regime creates the condition in which the people become their own repressors, their own police, their own controllers. That is, of course, the best that can happen for a totalitarian regime, but it's, of course, very complicated for the people to process, because they are simultaneously victims and a little bit at a low level kind of co-perpetrators for maintaining the state of dictatorship, which is difficult to understand seen retrospectively, seen from today's point of view. But in any case, what is important to remember is that it's not like this at all, that people were completely passive and lived in terror. No, like within the constraints that determine their behavior, they try to make the best way possible for themselves, the best life possible for themselves, and they made choices. They could collaborate more or less, they could help more or less, they could resist more or less, and there was a measure of individual choice involved. So people were genuinely social actors and not just passive recipients. As I started to indicate, it's complicated because it's not at all a simple, a simple mind frame of the powerful regime on the one hand, the powerless citizen on the other. It was a lot more complicated, and of course the temptation, especially in the beginning, but all the time in fact, the temptation once the regime falls is to describe it as having been an overwhelming dictatorship, and that the poor people couldn't do anything, and we were all victims, apart from a few traitors, and we should all cry about how terrible it was. And that's of course legitimate. It's also partly true. Everybody was a victim in the sense that nobody could go out as they wanted, nobody could say what they wanted. So that's for sure not a pleasant way of life. But at the same time, it's more difficult to, it's not the whole story. By far not. And in fact, if you want to tell the whole story, you have to question the behavior of people. And especially you have to, and in order to do that, as I said, you have the very important database that is now the archives of the secret police. But then as a historian, or even as a citizen, you have to wonder and to question yourself, and what do you do with this kind of archives? Because they stem, after all, from people that we don't like from today's point of view. People who supported the wrong kind of regime, people who supported this dictatorship, and people who were wishing for it to continue. So they had a vision of the world that is not at all what we have, and we have to wonder if what they wrote can be believed, quite simply. I mean, is this the truth? When the secret police describes something, they have a particular intent, and that intent is, of course, to discourage any form of opposition and to prolong the life of the dictatorship as long as possible. So these are not good people, these are not nice people. And what do we do with what they write? And there are many examples, but I will take one from a friend of mine who, because people were so surveilled by the secret police, because the secret police would spy on you, would listen to your telephone, would read your mail. There was no email at the time, but you received letters, so they would open the letters, read what is in there, possibly even strike in black, what they didn't want you to see, and of course place informants within your friends, within your colleagues, within your acquaintances, and sometimes even within your family. It's not unheard of that a wife would be spying on the husband or vice versa. There were such cases that came to the fore after '89. So by spying on the person so intensely, the secret police got to know your most intimate secrets, and very often they would discover, very often, I exaggerate, but if it happened, they would discover that that, for instance, a dissident, a person of object, was having an extramarital affair. Yeah, and so the police would know with whom, how often they met, would know way too much. And then you're left with, and sometimes they used it, by the way, to blackmail this person. They would say, well, if you don't want us to tell your wife or your husband, then, sign this pledge of collaboration with us. And in many cases, it actually happened. So now, but we found ourselves after '89, you're a historian sitting in the archives and you have this material, what do you do with it? It raises a number of moral dilemmas that you yourself, don't know how to solve. Like, should you tell the wife now that you know? Should you speak about the dissident? Sometimes the dissident is dead, sometimes not. What kind of information, what kind of role are you supposed to play as a historian? Are you supposed to prolong this toxic influence of the secret police, sometimes 20 years, 30 years after the fall of the regime? So the example I wanted to tell was of a friend of mine whose father was a dissident, and this happened 15 years ago. A historian found in the archives that his father, who was by then dead, had an affair with another woman than his mother, and he actually had a child with that other woman. So my friend had actually a brother or sister, I forgot, a sibling. And the historian found it relevant to go tell him that, hey, you didn't know, but you actually have a brother or sister. Yeah? Is this the role of a historian? I don't know. My friend was really shocked. The family didn't know. And you really have to question whether it's a good thing to do, after the regime is already fallen, the secret policeman is doing something else, maybe he's dead too, whatever. Like, should we prolong this influence that they had, the way they poisoned the life of the people? Should we do this in their name after they're long gone? That's the question, of course. So that's one source that is really difficult to master, and difficult to master in an ethical way. That's one thing. And none of the post-communist countries really did it very well, apart maybe from East Germany, for the good reason that the East German state ceased to exist and the archives were put at the disposal of West German authorities who did not have a vested interest into it. And they had much more money as well. So I think they managed it a lot better, but none of the other post-communist countries really managed it very well. It took a very long time. And in many countries, there's still no real ethical codex. So it's still up to the historian, and there were many scandals that were maybe not necessary. Then there are other sources. There's, of course, the official media. That is also obviously distorted because it reproduced the point of view of the regime. But it's also more complicated than we usually like to think. So it's not as if the newspapers from the communist regime were telling just lies. They were telling, I would say, in average, 50 to 75% of the truth. It's just that they presented it in a very distorted way. And you have to learn to decipher what was the ideological distortion as opposed to what was an actual lie, which didn't happen actually that often. But I will give you an example. Communist countries, as a rule, presented America as a bad country and as a very racist country, where African Americans in the US were subject to racism and discriminated, and this is doubtless true. It's absolutely true. This is not a lie. But maybe what the people, the populations of the East European countries, or east of the Iron Curtain, which is actually Central Europe, what they actually thought probably was not primarily that the US were racist. What they would primarily think probably is that the US was a rich country where there was a high standard of living, and when consumption society was developing at a high pace, and what kind of society they would very much like to live in. So it's not as if it was not true. It's just that, was it the main information the people would have liked to hear, or would have thought, or even in Western Europe, we certainly knew that the US are racist, but we also thought of them as this big modern capitalist model also for Western Europe. So it's just a question of how you prioritize and how you, what information you present as being the most important. And then of course there's the reports. You can use the reports from Western press, so Western press correspondents, who try to travel in the countries and try to report on it. But of course it's not easy, because within the constraints of what I spoke about, that if people spoke their mind, it was enough to land them in jail. Of course, they didn't want to speak their mind. So it was very difficult for foreign press correspondents to actually find somebody who would tell what people actually thought about the regime. So that complicated their work quite a bit. Nevertheless, it's at times a very interesting source. And then there's, of course, oral history. That is, after the regime has fallen, we go to the people and we ask them how they experienced this regime. But there's also a very big bias at stake, in the sense that the way in which you ask the question will determine the answer. And bad historians and people who are not historians but do oral history often don't realize this. And so they will go to a person and say, typically, tell us how bad your life was under communism, for instance. And of course, if you ask the questions this way, the person will tell you how bad life was under communism, but will also, from that point on, will never think about how life was also good under communism, or there were aspects that people actually enjoyed or actually liked. And it would kind of rewrite their memory, so that from that point on, when anybody asks them how their life was under communism, they will answer bad. You know, you kind of participated to rewriting this layer of memory. Whereas had you asked this person, tell us about your life under communism, then the person might spontaneously have answered, well, there were good aspects and bad aspects, and these were the good, these were the bad. Yeah, so it's a very simplified example, but it's just to say that there is no neutral questioning, and the questioning determines the answer, and that is crucial in remembering. So the only way to make it work, to make a historical work that is actually relevant, is to cross-check the sources, to compare different kind of sources, and to always be aware that there is no such thing as historical truth, in the sense that everything might be true, but it's a different angle. And so you have to be aware of your own angle and the angle you choose to bring to your students. That there's no absolute in terms of truth. There's only the way in which you present it according to your own values that are determined by the times you live in. There's no distinction between past and present. In the present, we select things from the past to make a point about our present. So it's important to remember that past and present are always linked. Then there's the question of talking about angles. There's the question of methodology. Do you want to look at things from the top down or from the bottom up. The top down is what we have done in history practically since forever that we write history. Certainly in the 19th and 20th century, we have concentrated a lot on political elites. What are the leaders doing? What are they saying? How did they get to power? How did they maintain themselves in power? How did they fall out of power? What do they want to do? What do they impose on the populations? We tend to look at things from the top down and from the point of view of political history. And then, after Nazism, German historians were quite interested in explaining how it is possible that a society that was civilized, westernized, that was, supposed to be at the forefront of humanity, could support or at least not protest against practices that were so inhumane. How is that possible? So they started to try and look at things from the other way around, from the bottom up, to look at how people had actually experienced Nazism. What did they actually think about Nazi leaders? What did they actually think about Hitler, about all the others? How did they receive the information that was conveyed to them from the top down? And how could they endorse what was going on? And so the angle shifted completely, and now you try to see how exactly what I described before, how people actually negotiated in a way their survival under this dictatorship. Sometimes at the price of the life of others, sometimes to just denounce somebody else in order to have a better standing with the regime, or in order to save themselves sometimes. Or they made small compromises here and there, or they agreed to do something even though they knew it was not ethically right or morally right, but it helped them, so they did it. Sometimes they believed in it. In fact, often they believed in it, both under Nazism and communism. Very often they thought they were doing the right thing, and so they didn't see it as bad as we'll see it retrospectively. So this notion of looking at things from the bottom up, looking at people as being active social actors rather than passive recipients of terror, and looking at it as a way to as a way of social negotiation changes completely the way you look at the dictatorship. I'll give you a couple of examples from what is a social negotiation. Well, you might say, this person in this small town wants to buy a plot of land to build a house. And so they go to the town authorities, say, I would like to buy this plot of land. And the local authorities, inform the secret police, and then next thing you know, the secret police is at your door, and they say, yeah, you want to buy this plot of land? Okay, we'll help you. We'll make it happen. But, we really need to know what your neighbors are saying. So we help you acquire this plot of land. You help us by informing us on what the neighbors are saying. Yeah, that's one example. Or basically anytime you wanted to get something, that was an opportunity for you to be blackmailed. So I don't know, you're at work and you're a good worker and you think you deserve a promotion, and you ask for this promotion, and the secret police will come to you and say, hey, you're right, you deserve this promotion, but we really want to know what your boss is thinking. So can you tell us about what your boss is thinking, and we'll help you get the promotion? Or I don't know, anything, like you don't want to come into the Communist Party because you don't want to get yourself dirty by participating into this regime, which happened quite often. People refuse to step in the Communist Party. And then the party or the police will come to you and say, hey, your daughter is now 18, she just finished high school, she's about to enter university, she passed her exams, but we can prevent it from happening. So if you want your daughter to study at university, step into the Communist Party. Do this for us. We'll do this for you, do this for us. A tit for a tat. And that placed people in impossible situations in which they had to either sacrifice something in their own life, in the life of their loved ones, especially, children is a particularly nasty example because everybody wants the best for their children. So it's very easy to be blackmailed on this. So all this taken together shows that the life within the constraints I described was a lot more complicated than people simply suffering. Which brings me also to the question of nostalgia, which might sound weird today, like why would people be nostalgic about a time when it was so hard on them and they suffered in a way? Because you would not be able to understand how the regime lasted for so long, for 4 decades in Central Europe, 7 decades in the Soviet Union, if you don't understand that the regime also negotiated with you by giving you some things in the hope to discourage you from rebelling against them. So essentially, what people were most grateful for, and they were genuinely grateful, and it would be a mistake not to see it today. That's also why communist parties after 1989 continued to poll a lot of votes in many countries, and when not communists, sometimes socialists. And people experienced genuine nostalgia is because there was the security of employment. Under communism, people remembered the economic crisis of the 1930s, after 1929. They remembered very well the huge level of poverty there was at the time. They remember the millions of people that were unemployed, that could not feed their families, and they were grateful that no matter what happens under communism, and also thanks to the fact that it's guaranteed by the Soviet Union, no matter what you do, what you say, you're going to be fed and you're going to be making a living, because it was compulsory to have a job. And so the regime could never refuse you to have a job. Like, even if you were a dissident, you were still entitled to have a job. So that gave us sort of freedom that was unknown in the West, the freedom to be sure that you're secure in your life. And that is not something that is to be discarded today as a detail. It's crucial for people's lives. And it was incidentally also very important for women, because there is a certain level of behavior from your husband that you're not going to tolerate, knowing that you can live on your own very easily. Or very easily is maybe exaggerated, but you will always have a job and you will always be able to provide for your children. And that gave women a lot more freedom in that sense, a freedom that took a lot longer to arrive in the West. So it's just to underline that not everything was negative about the regime, and that explains also why they might be nostalgic about it. Like, life was more simple. If you didn't speak, you were guaranteed a standard of living, and the regime did some things for you. For instance, recreation was free, or vacation was much cheaper. People were taken to the seaside for the first time in their lives, and it was all paid by the trade union. So there were some elements that people actually enjoyed. And it would be foolish to deny it today. Most countries were not very tolerant about collaborators and liked to point their fingers at them and say, look at these bad people, look what they did. I would never have done that. I think it's a little hypocritical, because if we put ourselves in the shoes of the people who were led to collaborate, it was not always that easy. And I think we should be tolerant and take into account what a judge would call the extenuating circumstances. That is, get to know the historical context around why they did it. A pilot I spoke to, so he was a pilot in the national airlines, and one time somebody tried to kidnap him, in fact, kidnap the pilot to reroute the plane towards the west to escape, right? And he was under attack, and he actually helped the police capture this person. So this guy was arrested, went to jail, and he received a note on the secret police noticed that this seemed to be somebody who was loyal to the communist regime, so somebody that could be counted on, and he was a pilot. So one day, a few weeks later, they turned up at his door and said, well, would you like to collaborate with us? And what do you do then? I mean, it's easy to condemn from the outside today, but what do you do when your job is given to you by the state? Your daughters or your children are, growing up, soon will try to go to high school, and then you would like, of course, for them to study. Later in university, your wife has a job, you have a very good job. Are you going to say no? It's not that easy. And a lot of people didn't feel they were capable of resisting, first of all because they were scared, and because they were scared for their future. and the police could have ruined everything. You know, instead of being a pilot, he could have been sweeping toilets in the, in the next public toilets. So, you know, it's problematic, and a lot of people felt they were not in a position to refuse. So a lot of those cases occurred when it's the police that found you, rather than you deciding to collaborate. Yeah. And so he did, and a lot of people thought, okay, I signed because I'm scared, but I will try not to endanger anyone. People thought naively that maybe they can get away with this, or maybe they will see, after I write a couple of reports that are very uninteresting, they will leave me alone, which sometimes happened. They were left alone, but nevertheless, after '89, they were still on the list of collaborators, so they were still, pointed at and shown as bad people. And then there's another kind of motivation for participating to collaborating with the secret police, and one that is often overlooked as well, and it can be that people actually wanted to because they actually believed in the system. And there is, for instance, I found in the archive the case of two sisters. So the family was very poor in the 1930s, precisely in the frame of the economic crisis I spoke about. In fact, the family was so poor, they were small agricultural workers, that the parents didn't have enough to feed the daughters, and so the daughters were given up to adoption. It's not that they didn't want to see them, they stayed in touch, they still met afterwards, but they just couldn't feed them. So one was given to a German-speaking family that lived in the area, and another one to a Czech-speaking family. We're talking here about the border region between Austria and Czechoslovakia. And there was still a sizable German-speaking minority at the time. So the sisters stayed in touch, also stayed in touch with the parents, but they were raised by two different families. And then 1945 happened, and all the German speakers were expelled from Czechoslovakia as so-called Sudeten Germans, that is, as people who were supposed to have supported the Nazis, which was not always true, but anyway, they were all expelled towards Germany and Austria. And so this sister who stayed in the Czech Republic, it was Czechoslovakia at the time, suddenly had a sister in West Germany. And so she was given compassionate visas, and possibilities to travel in order for her to meet her sister. And so she traveled very often to West Germany, which was unusual at the time, especially in the 1950s. And the secret police came to her and said, well, listen, since you travel to West Germany, would you mind, keeping your ears open as to what Czech emigres say? What do the Germans say? What do the Americans say, since her sister was in the American occupation zone? And in fact, would you do us the mission of seducing this West German pilot and giving us information? And she said, yeah, I will do it. I will do it, and I will do it gladly, because I'm very grateful for the communist regime that saved my family from this terrible poverty we were in the 1930s, where our parents couldn't even feed us, the two daughters. And I'm very grateful that now I can make a living, I can raise a family. If this happened now, would still be together. And so I will do it gladly, out of patriotism for this communist regime. Yeah. So also that kind of things happened. It's certainly not the majority. It's probably a tiny minority, but still, it was not always and not only blackmailing. And just put yourself in the feet of these people and try to imagine how you would have solved it. And I believe, unfortunately, that most of us, that might include me, the thing is we don't know, we're not sure how we would have reacted, but most of us would not have been very courageous, and that's unfortunately the way it is. And the short answer is there is almost no justice to be had, unfortunately, because when a regime falls, the political regime falls, but the state is still there. And the state still needs, in the new regime, which is now presumably democratic, it still needs judges, policemen, border guards, school teachers. It still needs the whole apparatus that was functioning before in favor of the communist regime, but now needs to still function, otherwise there is no possible democracy. So in order to judge, say, the people who were responsible for the repression, you actually need judges. So you cannot fire all judges on the pretext that they were compromised with the communist regime. You cannot fire all the lawyers, the defense attorneys, all the people who participated in the system. You now need them, crucially, in order to judge them. You need the policemen in order to go and arrest them. And you still need to maintain public order. You need the border guards because, you still have borders to defend. You still need school teachers. I mean, the school teachers that were defending just yesterday the world vision of the communist regime, now all of a sudden have to teach, the democratic values of the new regime. You cannot fire them all. You can fire the most aggressive, the most dangerous among them, but the vast majority always survives from one regime to another. And the only thing you can do is hope that they convert to the new values, adopt the new values for themselves, and shift their loyalty from the old regime to the new regime. But in this context and in these circumstances, it's very difficult to put people on trial. And in all post-communist countries, the number of people who actually sat in jail for their participation in the regime is probably less than 10 in every country. Apart from East Germany, precisely because there was no more state to defend, there were no more state secrets to defend, there were no more elites to defend. You could afford, in this case, to really disband the state and bring a bigger form of justice. But even there were a lot more people who went to jail. But even there, the people never felt as if they had been vindicated, and as if the 40 years of dictatorship had actually been properly investigated and properly judged in court. This never happened anywhere, and it probably never happens anywhere. This is the big frustration that comes out of transitional regimes. There's not one model that actually really satisfies the people. Nowhere. Not out of communism, not out of apartheid, not of all these dictatorships that were in Latin America. It's all the same problem everywhere. Is you have this big frustration that justice has not been served. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. That is, of course, a very big question, a very important one, because in all post-communist countries, without exception, the communist past was instrumentalized for political purposes, in the sense that mainly it served to discredit anything that was left of center. So not only the communist parties, who for the most part disappeared, except the biggest case where it remained is Czechoslovakia, again because Czechoslovakia was maybe more communist than the other countries, because it really had, with East Germany, it really had a genuine working class and genuine left-wing values, so it kind of embraced communism with more gusto, say, than Poland and Hungary, that were more agricultural, had a very different kind of society, and had no left-wing values at the time. So what politicians did after '89 is essentially that conservative parties, born everywhere, tried to discredit anything left by saying that, well, communists and all communists are discredited and all communists are bad and everything communist is criminal, and so on. So that the left basically terribly suffered in Central Europe. And I would say it also terribly suffered in the West, also in Western Europe, because also there, even when they had not supported communist dictatorships, they still took a hit, in the sense that everything left took a hit also in the West, and we see the consequences all the way until today. Not that I want to defend the left at all costs, but it upset the balance of right against left, so that the right also had less opposition than it used to have. So that changed the political landscape everywhere, basically. So what happened, it was, in order, a glorification of victimhood. So anybody became a victim, and victims gained a lot of attention, which they doubtless deserved. I mean, some people were put in jail or were executed or whatever. So I mean, some commemoration was indispensable for, the renewal of the democratic state. But after maybe 10 or 20 years, the paying tribute to the victim became transforming them into heroes. And that happened also in more or less every country. And so there was all of a sudden a glorification of the opposition, of any form of opposition to the communist regime. And when there were no heroes, they were almost encouraged to appear out of thin air. You know, they were laws to encourage people to apply to anything small they might have done against the regime became an act of resistance, and they were glorified for it. And this process of remanufacturing a collective identity has often been quite artificial. And, you know, the temptation to glorify any opposition and to present as really evil situations in which people had no choice is really not working to the prospect of presenting a complexified history that I believe is actually much more real than to present, you know, only heroes and victims. And more often than not, this glorification of opposition also was had as a basis a nationalist feeling. You know, tried to present like patriots, people who defended the nation, as being opposed to the communist regime. This is especially true for Poland and Hungary. And this was used for political purposes in a way that was not very subtle and is not very tasteful very often. So we have to be careful how to speak of the past in present circumstances and how not to use it for political purposes.